you're beginning to tire of this, then my goal is being accomplished. That you would feel just how much life is out there, and then you can begin to feel what these critic is saying when they say, how do you fit all of this life on board Noah's Ark through a year-long flood and have that be scientifically plausible? Welcome to all those who are watching from wherever you are around the globe. Welcome if you're a creationist or a skeptic of creation science. Glad for both of those audiences, and there'll be something, I think, for all of you. If it's late or in the wee hours where you're watching, I have some good news. This talk might be a little spicier than what you're used to, because we're going to deal with what the critics say. So that tends to keep me awake, and it'll keep you awake, I think, in case you're at a time zone where it's tough to watch. Before I jump in, though, and I should mention that we're going to have a little bit of a surprise at the end, so stay tuned for that. I want to start with prayer, and then I'll give you the overview of the ground we're going to cover, and then we're going to dive into it. So let me pray, and then we'll get to the content. Father, we thank you for today. I pray that you give me wisdom in communicating this topic and this content clearly, that you'd guide and watch over all the technicalities of the technology, that it would work well. Pray that you'd give us soft hearts to receive what your word says and faith to believe it, in Christ's name. Amen. What we're going to do in this session is focus on something in the theme of this entire conference, Noah's Ark, and its relevance to life and biology. You heard about the fossils in the previous hour. We're going to focus on the living side of life, those species that are still in existence. And when I say species, I mean just basic types of life. I mean it in the scientific sense as well, a category of classification. We're not going to get too technical, though. We're going to ask the question, can the flood account plausibly explain what we see on the planet today? And we're going to do this by engaging directly the questions that skeptics raise, and then answer them, and then deal with questions they raise in response to that, and then answer those. And again, we're going to keep it very understandable, so don't worry about it getting too technical. And the surprise at the end is we're going to step back and reflect on the strength of the evidence for this creation science position. So I've given this a title that's, like I said, in line with today's theme, but it's really an answer to Darwin's book itself. When we're talking about the animals on Noah's Ark, off Noah's Ark, coming off Noah's Ark, we're dealing with the question of the origin of species. That's the fundamental question Darwin tried to answer. That's the fundamental biological question that has dominated the creation evolution debate for the last century and a half. So this is a big topic we're going to try to sink our teeth into. The outline, as I already alluded to, make sure I can click here, there we go, follows from what critics of creation science have levied against the creation science position. For many years, critics have said there's no way you can fit all the species on Earth, all the living forms of life, all of life on board the Ark, and have this story make sense. It's one of the common objections to a straightforward reading of Genesis. And I'll get into some of this more at the end as well and talk about how prominent critics have repeated this objection to this day. We're going to deal with that. There are some critics of creation science who are aware of the response that creationists have given over the years, and they've come up with a second criticism. That's what gave rise to this title here, hyperevolution. If that's a term that's new to you, it'll become much more familiar as we get to the second half of this talk. We're going to deal with the question of hyperevolution, and I'll explain it, and you'll see that this is a criticism in response to an objection. And what we're going to see, just to give you a preview, if we think of the types of criticisms that critics have raised against creation science, they've sort of attacked it from one side. Creationists have answered it. So they've come from the other side and tried to attack it from there, and we'll try to answer that as well. But we're gonna step back again at the end, and there's going to be a surprise in terms of the strength of the evidence, because we're going to answer the question, how strong is the evidence? Again, through the critics. I'm going to let the critics tell us how strong the evidence is for the creation science position. And really, it's a question of how strong is the evidence for the creation explanation for the origin of species, the 150-year-old question that drives the creation evolution debate. So let's start with this first objection, the common one that you've probably dealt with yourself. And again, if you're watching this as a critic, perhaps you've raised this question yourself. I'm speaking primarily here to creationists, but I'm glad you've joined us if you're in that category of skeptic, and I hope you'll listen carefully because it deals directly with the evolution question. So how could Noah fit all those animals on board the ark? And before we try to answer it, I want you, the viewer, to feel the weight of this objection from the skeptic. I want you to feel what they feel when they're talking about this. And when I say they, I'm thinking specifically of biologists or of lay people who are aware of just how many life forms exist or have existed on Earth. I'm going to touch the past tense just briefly. We often think of dinosaurs primarily when we think of life forms that once existed but no longer do. And I'm just going to acknowledge the fact that there are these species out there that the skeptics want to know how we fit them on board the ark. For sake of time, and because Dr. Haynes discussed fossils in the previous hour, I want to focus primarily on the living species, if for no other reason that these species alone cause the skeptic angst and give the skeptic enough ammunition to raise an objection, at least one that's quite popular. What I want you to see in the next few minutes is just how much life is out there. And when we're done, I want you not just to know that there's far more life out there than what you're probably used to thinking about. I want you to know that there's far more life even in the familiar forms. Giraffes, rhinos, elephants, zebras. There's more of these types of creatures out there than you're used to thinking about. And this is all in the mind of the skeptic when they raise this question. So not just to know it, but to feel this so that you can feel the weight of this objection. If we start in the sea, there's far more life in the oceans, in the lakes, than we're used to thinking about. Take a careful look at the screen. I don't know how big it is if you're looking at a tablet or a phone, but there's all sorts of different fish types out here. There's living things, corals and such. You can see in the screen, notice there's some green fish over here. There's lots of life just in this one image. There's all sorts of species out there. Fish are the typical types of aquatic creatures that we think of. There are more exotic ones, some of which are still familiar, like the octopus. But there are different types of octopi, different types of squid. There's cuttlefish. This category of sea life, octopi and squid and such, are known as cephalopods. That's the technical term. How many different types of cephalopods are there? We just looked at 3 pictures of them. An octopus and a cuttlefish here, in the previous slide, a squid. Well, how many total are there? Over 800. Well, that may not seem like a lot. It's a big number, but it's not huge. But I'm going to guess that's a lot more than any viewer could name offhand. If I said, tell me how many types, how many species of cephalopods, octopi, and squid and such there are, I don't know that anyone could come up with 800. Of course, there's more than just that type of life in the oceans. There's starfish, which are classified as echinoderms. There's oysters and shellfish and such. There's crustaceans. So if you're a seafood lover, you might enjoy eating them. Well, do you know how many different types of crustaceans there are? Lobsters, crabs. Over 40,000. That's a bigger number than we just looked at for cephalopods. So maybe now you're beginning to feel just how much life is out there that most of us don't ever bother thinking about. The biggest numbers, though, come when we start to think about life on land, the invertebrates on land. So the cephalopods, octopi and squid, and the crustaceans are all invertebrates. The land invertebrates include things like spiders, like this tarantula, and I'm going to leave it on the screen because it tends to make people uncomfortable. It also makes me uncomfortable, so I'll advance it now. But there's many more different types of spiders, and this definitely makes me uncomfortable, so I'm going to keep advancing. How many different species of spiders are there? Let's keep going because I don't like this. Over 40,000. So it's enough just to have the few species that come into your house to think about. There's over 40,000 different types that roam this planet. You can think about that as you go to sleep tonight or whatever time zone you're in. How many different types of butterflies are there? If you were tasked with drawing different types of moths and butterflies, how many could you come up with? The number that have been classified are around 150,000. There's a massive number of butterflies. What about beetles? This screen is helpful because it shows you just a sample, a small taste of the variety of ways you could design a beetle, make a beetle. And in terms of beetle species, there's over 300,000 beetle species. So there's a lot more life out there than we're used to thinking about. This is just, again, broad brushstrokes, representative examples. This is not all of life. I want to shift gears, though, and go towards even the familiar life to show you that there's more of these types of creatures than we're used to thinking about. How many different species of elephants are there? If you stop and think about it, you'll say, yeah, okay, I recognize the Asian elephant, or excuse me, the Asian elephant here on the right, smaller ears, different shaped skull, the African elephant on the left here. But did you know there's a third species of African elephant, the African forest elephant? It's smaller than the savanna elephant. That doesn't seem like a big increase, 3 species instead of 2, but that's more than we're used to thinking about. And if every single type of familiar creature out there has more species than we're used to thinking about, those numbers add up. How about giraffes? For years, scientists have spoken of a single species, just one. But if you look closely at what roams the African savannas and plains, you can see their coat colors vary. There are some that are almost albino looking. In the last couple of years, scientists have done a genetic analysis of these visually different giraffe types and have published evidence suggesting that there are in fact 4 different giraffe species. Again, 4 is not a huge number, but 4 versus just 1 is an increase, more than what we're used to. What about deer? 4-legged ruminant creatures. How many different types of deer are there? If you're a hunter, you might recognize white-tailed deer versus mule deer, especially if you're a hunter in North America. Again, if you're on the same continent as I am, I live in Kentucky here in the United States, you might recognize the elk. If you live in more northerly regions, perhaps the caribou, the moose. If you're in Europe, you might recognize the red deer. If you're elsewhere in the globe, you might recognize some of these other species. And if you live, let's say in North America or Europe, you might not even have known that such species of deer even exist. And again, that's my point. There's more species alive on this planet, and just ignoring the dead ones, the extinct ones, just in terms of what's living today, there's a lot more out there than what we're used to thinking about. There's a lot more unfamiliar that's out there. And even in the familiar types of creatures like deer, there's a whole lot more species than we're used to thinking about. So I'm going to start advancing these slides faster, just so you begin to get a sense of how much is out there. We don't use up all of our time. But I want you to begin to feel just how heavy this is. You might say, I've never seen these types of deer. I tried to trick you here. These aren't deer anymore. And you may not even notice when I switched over from the deer family, known as Cervidae, to the bovid family, Bovidae. These, what I just showed you here, a couple of these are duikers. They're in the bovid family, the same family that includes cattle, sheep, antelopes. These guys are part of that family. The difference between the bovid family and the cervid family, so the difference between the deer family and the one that contains cattle and sheep and goats and antelopes, is that deer have branched horns. This is one of the differences. And bovids have unbranched horns. So you can see that they can be straight, they can be curved, but they don't start branching off like your typical deer does. If you're beginning to wonder when we're going to stop advancing through these slides, that's part of my goal here. You can start to see perhaps some of these familiar bucks and antelope and such, gazelles. If you're beginning to tire of this, then my goal is being accomplished. That you would feel just how much life is out there. And then you can begin to feel what these critic is saying when they say, how do you fit all of this life on board Noah's Ark through a year-long flood and have that be scientifically plausible? So now we're getting towards the cattle type creatures. Good, but we're not done. I haven't shown you any sheep or goats. Here's an eland, western giant eland. There's a bongo. Tired of it yet? Kudus. Still no sheep or goats. All of these different life forms. Some that look like they come out of Star Wars. Strange looking nose. This is an Asian species of bovid. Now finally some of the sheep and goats. Okay, but there's a lot more sheep and goat species than we're used to thinking about. I'm tired of doing this, so I hope it ends soon. Some of these are, this is a seerau, I think, classified in the sheep-goat subsection of bovids. If you combine the deer and bovid families together, there's 190 species. In this tiresome series of slides, I've shown you less than 150 of them. There's a lot of them out there. Bears are familiar. How many bear species are there? Could you name them if I ask you? There's 8. What about raccoons? In our zoo, we have a raccoon relative. This is a coati, 14 species. What about cats, large and small, house cats to large cats like lions and tigers? 37. What about weasels and badgers? One of my favorites because I was born in Wisconsin, raised there, state animal, the badger, wolverines and such. 58 species in Mustelidae. That's the name of the family that contains these. What if you're watching from Australia? How many species of marsupials roam the planet? Even if you're watching from North America, we have a marsupial up here, the opossum. Several marsupials in South America as well. Over 330 species of marsupials. What about primates? You've got the great apes, chimpanzee, orangutan, gorilla. You've got gibbons, lemurs, tarsiers, baboons. Over 400 species of primates. What about bats? I tend not to think about these. Many of them are nocturnal. Over 1,000 species of bats. What about rodents, rodent-like creatures? From beavers to mice and rats, chipmunks, squirrels. Over 2,000. And much of what I've shown you here in terms of images, the vertebrates, those that have backbones, have been mammals. We haven't even touched on the reptiles, like alligators and crocodiles and gharials. Reptiles include lizards, snakes, turtles, tortoises. How many species of reptiles? Over 10,000. What about amphibians, including frogs and salamanders, toads, and creatures like this? This is not a worm. This has a backbone. It's a caecilian. There's over 7,000 species of amphibians. Birds, from large birds of prey that soar to those that have long legs, colorful birds like the toucan, songbirds, over 10,000 bird species. Altogether, there's 1.6 million species on Earth that we've classified, and there's probably more. They're discovering new, scientific community is discovering new species every year. How do you fit all of that life, living things? Forget the fossils, just the living things. Forget the extinct species. How do you fit all that life on this rinky-dink little boat? That's the objection I want you to feel. And if you've been in creation science circles a long time, you already might know some of these answers. The first answer to this, of course, is that this is not what the ark looked like, some rinky-dink little boat, even though the Sunday school lessons often show it as such. Genesis 10 says, the length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. We don't typically measure things in cubits anymore. So if you convert it, let's say, to the imperial system, feet, the ark was 510 feet long, 51 feet high. And if you live in the United States and familiar with our yellow school buses as a reference point, the ark is 12 school buses long, lined up end to end. And if you could stack them on top of each other, it would be 4 buses high. And if you line them up side by side, 10 buses wide. Now, the ark isn't just one big spacious room. It has 3 decks in it. So the volume of the ark is relevant. So again, if you're in the United States, you're familiar with a semi-tractor trailer. It has a certain volume inside of it. The volume of one of those is just a small fraction of the volume of the ark. You need 483 of these semi-tractor trailers to have the same volume. as what would have been inside Noah's Ark, given the biblical dimensions. And if you make it to Kentucky here in North America, in the United States, we've built a full-scale model, a full-scale replica, so that you can feel the size of that in person, stand next to it and see just how large it was. So that's the first point to consider when the skeptic says, how in the world do you fit 1.6 million species on board the ark and more? Well, the ark is a big ship. Secondly, the purpose of the ark is to survive a flood. And if there's a flood and your primary environmental residence is water, there's no need to take you on board an ark. Noah does not need to build an aquarium for the whale shark or for the sperm whale or for the giant manta ray. All these aquatic creatures can survive a flood in the oceans. Now, many of them died and were buried. But again, you think about what happened on land. Here's a sea urchin, another octopus. You think about what happened on land. The point was not to save every single living individual. It was to save representatives of each. And so if you're an oceanic creature, yeah, many of them will die, just like land creatures died, but it's a lot easier to survive a flood in the water if you're an aquatic creature than if you're a land one. The ark is built for land-dependent creatures, not aquatic ones. So if you remove, if you consider that fact, you can remove tens of thousands of species from your list. Now, tens of thousands doesn't put a huge dent in 1.6 million, but this is just a second point. And here's the biblical justification for why we're looking at land-dependent creatures. Genesis 6:20, God tells Noah, bring the birds after their kind, animals after their kind, every creeping thing of the earth after its kind. And Genesis 7 specifies those creatures in which is the breath of life. Now that term, the breath of life, is debated among theologians. And it's debated not just in the context of the flood. This is a relevant question right at the beginning of the Bible. God creates, speaks into existence the whole universe, including the life on the earth. And there's no death, there's no suffering. It's a perfect world. There's no sin. So what happens when Adam and Eve take a walk in the garden? Go through a park. Put their bare feet in the mud. Would they ever have stepped on an ant? Swatted a fly? Crushed an earthworm? Are all of those creatures ones in which there was the breath of life? It's a critical question right at the beginning, and also then you need to apply it to Genesis 6-8. There are theologians who would say, no, the breath of life doesn't apply to many of the invertebrate land creatures. That would eliminate a massive number of species to be brought on board the ark. So insects and such, arthropods, would eliminate a huge chunk of the species that were brought on board the ark. I'll return to this question in a minute as we consider whether or not they would have been brought on board. But if we ignore those for the moment, the main categories of creatures, I think Noah would have brought on board the ark, include mammals. They're land dependent. Mammals are vertebrate creatures. Reptiles, amphibians, and birds. And if you add up all those species together that are alive today, you have 34,000. Again, we've focused on just the living creatures from the start. And so if you take what the Bible says explicitly about the animals Noah's to take on board, that number is only about 2% of all life that roams this planet. Noah does not need to take millions and millions of species on board the ark. Those categories of animals that are relevant is only 2% of the total. And it's not species Noah's to take on board the ark. If you look at the specific statements in Genesis 6, it's a category that's altogether different. God says, bring the birds after their kind. So this is a verse I just read, but I'm emphasizing a different aspect of it. Animals after their kind, every creeping thing of the earth after its kind. Well, what does that term mean? An earlier verse and a later verse in chapter 7 help clarify this. God tells Noah to bring male and female on board the ark. Why? Genesis 7, to keep the New King James says species. It's a mistranslation. Fortunately, my New King James has a note that says what's translated as species in Genesis 7:3 should be translated as seed. And that's the accurate translation. The Hebrew word is the same word that's used in Genesis I think it's 13. God tells Abraham, Abraham's looking out over the promised land. God promises that land to Abraham and to his species. No, to his seed, to his descendants. That's the same word here. And it makes sense. You bring male and female, the two units of reproduction, to keep that line, that lineage going, to keep their offspring going. You look at the commands in Genesis 9 after the flood is over, and there's a repetition of the commands that God gave in Genesis 1. Be fruitful and multiply. Well, you need male and female to do that. Well, why would I camp out on this point? Because this then gives us a criterion by which to identify kinds. I haven't yet told you what a kind is. We can use that criterion, male and female, to be able to reproduce as a test to identify which creatures are part of the same kind. And it's not species, even though the classic definition of species uses reproduction as a criterion. The number of definitions for species has multiplied over the years, and there's some ambiguity. And what happens then are results like this. If you come to the Creation Museum, I showed you a picture of the Ark. We also have a Creation Museum 45 minutes away. I'm here on site at the Creation Museum. We have a petting zoo, and we have two of what I think are some of the prettiest creatures on Earth. On the left is a zorse. On the right is a zonkey, so the brown and then, or sort of, I should say the tan with black partially striped creature here is a cross between a horse and a zebra, classified as separate species. But look, here's a live adult offspring. They tend to be infertile, and I'll address that more in a moment. Here is a cross between a donkey and a zebra, this zedonk. Let me just make a brief comment here about the fact that these tend to be infertile because of different chromosome numbers. From a biological perspective, this is pretty good evidence that they're once part of the same kind, and I'll tell you why. That's the conclusion. Here's why. If you look broadly at the ways in which reproductive compatibility can break down, this is at a far end of the spectrum. So at one end of the spectrum, you can have mating calls. Let's say you're thinking about bird species. Mating calls in which the female won't respond to the male. And so they never even mate. That's it. So that reproductive compatibility breaks down. You may have mating that occurs, but sperm and egg can't join because the genetics of it are mismatched. So reproductive compatibility breaks down. You can have sperm and egg that fuse, but then let's say the embryo doesn't implant in the mother's womb if you're talking mammals. You can have some that implant, but the baby doesn't come to term. And all these various steps of the process, this attempt at reproduction can break down. So the fact that it was successful all the way up to getting live, healthy adult offspring, except that they can't necessarily further reproduce, this is pretty good. You can have reproductive incompatibility that arises over time from previously reproductively compatible individuals. That's another story for another day. That's just to give you a brief window into why, from a biologist's perspective, this is really, really good. A high degree of success and good evidence that horses, donkeys, and zebras were once part of the same kind, even though today they're classified as separate species. We'll return to this subject, to these specific example more in a moment. The liger, cross between a lion and a tiger, is another example of species that can produce live adult offspring. And to not belabor the point, but to summarize it, make a long story short, as a general rule of thumb, the breeding studies that have been done in animals have landed on a fairly consistent explanation for what a kind is. Here I'm using members of the fox family as an illustration. So the red fox down here at the bottom is a species of fox. It's classified as a separate species from the Arctic fox, and these two species are different enough that not only are they placed in separate species categories, they belong to each its own genus, the plural being genre. So they're placed in separate genre. The Arctic fox and red fox, together with other foxes and coyotes and dogs and wolves, belong to this family that's called Canidae. The canids are all one family. The dog family, fox family, belongs to the larger order Carnivora, carnivores. That includes things like walruses and seals and cats and hyenas and such. Well, as a general rule of thumb, the family is what breeding studies point to as the best approximation of what a kind is. Now, this is a big game changer. Applied back here to this example, horses, donkeys, and zebras, there's actually 3 recognized species of zebras alive today. You can see the differences in their striping patterns, whether or not they cross the belly, how they look here on the haunches, whether they're very thin, like this one, or big and broad. 3 different species of zebras, 1 wild species of horse, 3 species of wild ass, and of course, countless breeds of horses and donkeys. Together, they form the equidae, the equid family. They were part of the same kind, most likely based on these breeding studies. And if you apply that back then to Genesis 6 and 7, what that means is Noah brought on board the ark 2 of the equid family. Not 2 zebras, not 2 of each of the 3 zebra species, not 2 of each of the wild ass species, not 2 of the wild horse species, not 2 of the horse breeds, but 2 members of this equid family. And from that family have descended, speciated, the 7 living species we see today. Do another example that's much more dramatic. These 7 bird species are part of the same kind based on breeding studies. You can see a cardinal here. There's a lot of visible diversity among these species. But this is just a fraction of the diversity within the kind to which these species belong. They belong to this sparrow-finch kind. And within this kind are over 1,000 bird species. Now, birds were brought by 7s. There's debate whether that means by 7 total or by 14, 7 pairs or 7 individuals. Either way, from a small group on board the ark, over 1,000 species have descended. And you can see a more detailed derivation of this. I did an article series on our website, The Origin of Species After the Flood. There's the title of the series. So if you just put that into our search engine on ancestorgenesis.org, you can pull this up, or if you just Google my name, you'll scroll through my articles and find this. Which animals were on the ark with Noah? Now, there are some critics of creation science who are aware that creationists actually believe this. And let me back up for a second, because I want to show you that, just to give you an example here, why this is such a critical issue. I've got a book here in my office by Jerry Coyne, prominent evolutionist here in the United States. So what Richard Dawkins is to UK readers, prominent atheist and evolutionist, you could make the case that Jerry Coyne is to US readers. Now, people on both sides of the pond probably read both of them, but this is an example of why evolution is true by Jerry Coyne, a defense of evolution for the layperson. Here is what he says. He's got an opinion about Noah's Ark, and he's got the opinion that I just described. I'm getting older, so I have to take my glasses off. He was talking, and this is page 88, 89 of his book, Why Evolution is True, mentions Noah's Ark. He's talking about biogeography, so the distribution of species geographically around the globe. So he says the roots of biogeography, this field of biology, lie deep in religion. The earliest natural theologians tried to show how the distribution of organisms could be reconciled with the account of Noah's Ark in the Bible. All living animals were understood as the descendants of the pairs that Noah took aboard, pairs that traveled to their present locations from the ark's post-flood resting place. Now, here's the key point. As naturalists continue to discover new species of plants and animals, even the staunchest believer realized that no boat could possibly hold them all, much less their food and water for a 6-week voyage. So he gets the length of the voyage wrong. He gets the kind concept wrong. He's reiterating the common notion that Noah brings species on board the ark. That's not what the scripture teaches. My point is, even some of the most prominent advocates of evolution and critics of creation science get this fundamental issue wrong. They don't represent what the scripture says accurately. There is a very small group that understands that modern creationists hold to this view. And one of their responses is that we have evolved. We've changed what the Bible says from what we used to believe. We've changed our views. We've changed what the scripture says to accommodate the advance of modern science. I listed that on a slide. I'll pull it up here real fast, just so we have it for reference. Here we go. So the first objection, looking at this question of Noah's Ark and life from the eyes of the critics, you can't fit all these species on board the ark. I just showed you, yes, you can, because you take kinds, you take the land-dependent kinds on this very big ship, it works. Well, those who are aware of this concept within creation science and who yet disagree with it have said, here's my second point, creationism has evolved to solve the problem of animals on board the ark. It's really not a fair thing for someone like me to say. It's not fair for me to derive this idea. It's cheating. Creationists used to believe something else, and now they've changed their views because science has made it uncomfortable. Well, let me reiterate why this article is so important, because I show from the text itself, step by step, this is what the Bible has always taught. This is not some newfangled idea that creationists suddenly saw in the scriptures but didn't see before. So that's critical. What's also critical as a refutation to that claim is quotes from the father of modern taxonomy. So let me stop for a moment and give you some background to Linnaeus before we realize why this quote is so critical. When we talk about the question of the origin of species, when we discuss the question of whether or not Noah could fit species on board the ark, we're really having a modern discussion. The word as we use it now wasn't invented until the 1700s. We wouldn't have this sort of back and forth and does this work, does this not work prior to the 1700s, because the term as we use it didn't exist. So the question is, what did creationists believe in the 1700s? When Linnaeus first came up with his system of classification, he had far fewer species on his list than we do today. And if we had time, I could show you a graph of how the number of species that we know has grown with time, a massive number. I think he had maybe only a few hundred mammals on his list. Now we have thousands of mammals, over 5,000 to 6,000 mammals that we know today. Well, what did Linnaeus think about what God did? He was a creationist. Initially, he thought that God created species, but it was the fact that different so-called species could interbreed that caused him to change his view. Linnaeus proposed that dog, wolf, and fox belong to the same created genus. Now we classify them in separate genre, at least the fox and the wolf, and that they were products of hybridization. So this idea that God creates kinds, so created genus, he's a creationist. This idea that God created kinds goes back to the beginning of the debate itself. You can't have a debate over the origin of species until Linnaeus invents the term, and Linnaeus himself advocated for this concept of kinds. This is not a recent invention. So just to summarize, here I finally have it on the screen what I mentioned earlier. How do you fit all those animals on board the ark? Well, the ark is a huge ship. The 1.6 million species do not go on the ark. No, God commands Noah to bring only a few, 2%. By the way, if you include insects and such, 0.3 is all the more relevant. Yes, there's over 1 million species of insects and arthropods and such. But if you look at kinds, that number drops dramatically. And of course, beetles, spiders are small creatures in terms of physical size. They don't take up much space. So you can easily fit all these on board the ark, and you can see it for yourself when you come down to the Ark Encounter, if you want it right in front of you, just to see how all this works together. So this is, in a sense, a long introduction to the topic that was the title of this talk. Does Noah's Ark force creationists to an idea of hyperevolution? Now we can finally discuss where this idea comes from and what it means. So again, Jerry Coyne and so many evolutionists out there are not aware that creationists believe in kinds. They think we believe that God takes species. And they think this is therefore an unsolvable problem for creationists and therefore a reason to reject the Bible. Not so. It's not what the Bible teaches. The animals fit on board the ark easily. This is not a recent invention. It's not that creationists have changed their position. Darwin himself was surprised to learn that Linnaeus advocated something similar. He didn't know that when he wrote his book. And of course, if you read On the Origin of Species by Darwin, he treats creationism as if it's this idea that God creates individual species that never change, doesn't deal with the flood. He really attacks a straw man. And of course, it'd be a shock to him then to find out that Linnaeus didn't hold to the view he was trying to beat down. Well, point 3 then is the response. I said, skeptics tend to box the biblical idea from one side. You can't fit all those animals on board the ark. Yes, you can. Kinds is what allows that to occur. Oh, well, there's a new problem that arises in light of that. It's hyperevolution. And let me explain what this means. What I wanted to emphasize with this slide is this idea is a reaction to the thesis I've just advanced, this idea of kinds. So thinking about the number of species that exist today, thinking again about mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and birds, the ones everyone would agree would need to go on board the ark, those categories of creatures. I said the species don't go on board the ark, it's more like kinds. It's around 1,400 total kinds that go on board the ark. Now that number includes ones that have gone extinct. So it's a pretty small number compared to 1.6 million species. So it's even less when you just think living kinds. There's probably less than 1,000 living kinds that went on board the ark. The extinct ones we can subtract. And in the last 4,500 years, the less than 1,000 living kinds have given rise to over 30,000 new species. This is what the evolutionist reflects on and says, that's crazy. You creationists, believe in more evolution than Darwin does. At least Darwin stretched out evolution over millions of years. You guys are trying to cram it all into this short time scale. Hyper evolution, massive amount of new species in a short amount of time. That's what the criticism represents. So just to go back to that slide, so you can connect the concept to the term. This is what they're now saying. Can't fit the animals on board the ark. Yes, you can. Kinds is the key concept. Well, kinds creates a new problem. You can't have that many species form that quickly. That's more evolution than Darwin advocates. So let's deal with that question. How do you get so many species in just a few thousand years? If you're interested in the long technical derivation and defense of it, I've got a paper you can find for free online. It's got this paragraph of a title that I co-wrote with a colleague, Jason Lyle. We work together at Answers in Genesis, work together at Institute for Creation Research. He has his own ministry now, and of course here I'm at Answers in Genesis now. We published it after I'd moved to Answers in Genesis. But this goes through the nitty-gritty genetic evidence for this and how this works. You can find even a more extended defense of this in the book Replacing Darwin, and a simplified version of it in Replacing Darwin Made Simple. I'll come back to these at the end. What I'm going to show you now is just the cliff notes, essentially, for sake of time and to keep it simple. So you know where to go if you want to find the details. So how do you get these 7 species from the ark in just 4,500 years? And look closely at these species. You've got one pair. These are unclean animals by biblical classification. So they would come in a single pair, not by sevens. That clean came by sevens. This is by one pair, just 2 animals, male and female. How did you go from that pair to get stripes of various styles? Unstriped, various colors, black and white, gray or silver, various shades of tan and brown. How do you get all that from a single couple? That's the question we're trying to solve. There's really a basic genetic explanation for this. Again, the technical detail in those resources I just mentioned. And to understand how this works, because this is very powerful even in its simplicity, let's designate the genetic information for stripes, just think about that for the moment, with capital letters, capital A, capital B, and the genetic information for solid coat pattern with lowercase letters, little a, little b. We're just going to use basic high school genetics. If you're a horse like this Przewalski's horse or some breed of horse, you don't have stripes. Now there are, on occasion, you can find bars on the back of the Przewalski's horse's leg. They're here at the local Cincinnati Zoo. I emailed the zoo folks and they said, yeah, occasionally I think they called them primitive markings, or they exist, these markings. So hinting of perhaps a striped past. Anyway, by and large, these are unstriped creatures. And so by definition, the genetics that encodes it must all be encoding no stripes, solids instead. And so therefore, these creatures must have all lowercase letters. You'll notice that each letter comes in duplicate, 2 A's, 2 B's, 2 A's, 2 B's. Why? Because each of these creatures, each of these individuals has the genetic information from one of each of the parents. Mom contributes an A, dad contributes an A. Or if you think about humans, it's not like dad contributes the information for the right side of my body and mom contributes the information for the left side. Dad has the information for the whole body, mom for the whole body, And in ways scientists don't fully understand, these two sets of information interact with one another and produce the mix of features that defines each one of us and that defines these horse individuals. So that's why there's duplicate, because it's two parents, two A's, two B's. What can these hypothetical horse parents produce? If this is what Noah brought on board the ark, what kinds of offspring could they produce? Well, again, back to high school genetics, you can use a Punnett square to figure out and calculate the frequency of the various types of offspring. So mom contributes one of the A's, one of the B's. Well, all she has is lowercase a, lowercase b. So all the options are all lowercase. And all the options here for dad, all lowercase, which means all the offspring are all lowercase, all solids. So if this is the type of creature Noah brought on board the ark, all of the offspring would have been solid color. You never would have gotten zebras. Well, simple solution, right? Just bring zebras on board the ark. Now you have the opposite problem. Same type though. These have stripes. By definition, they have all uppercase letters in terms of the genetics that encodes them. Again, they have two parents, so they have two A's, two B's, two A's, two B's. But they're all uppercase because they're striped. And so that means mom has all uppercase A and B, dad A and B, all uppercase to pass on. All the offspring are uppercase. All of them are striped. So once again, you're stuck. This doesn't get you to unstriped. If you have a fully striped ancestor, all you get are striped offspring. If you have a fully unstriped ancestor, you have only unstriped offspring. But what if you have something like this? I'm not saying exactly these creatures, but what if you had a pair on board the ark that was partially striped, like these individuals were? Your genetic information would be a mix of uppercase and lowercase letters by definition. Big A, big B, little b, because you're kind of a mix between the two. What happens then? This is where it gets wild. Mom can pass on an uppercase A or lowercase a, an uppercase B or lowercase b. So can dad. Same thing up here. And so if you combine all these with the Punnett square, some of the offspring are all uppercase, some are all lowercase, some are a mix. And you can produce a whole gamut of outcomes. And let me emphasize, a whole gamut of outcomes in a single generation. How do you get so many species fast? If you genetically hardwire the potential from the start. You do not need every single type of zebra, every single type of horse and donkey on board the ark to produce all this. You just need the genetic potential there. And it's hard-coded through this concept we call dominance and recessiveness. There's genetic information that can be hidden. And once you front load that genetic potential, you can produce a whole gamut of outcomes in a single generation. That's super fast. That's the key. And if you wanted to summarize the difference between the creationist explanation for the origin of species and the evolutionary explanation for the origin of species, this is it. It's a fundamental difference that the vast majority of evolutionists do not either don't comprehend or aren't aware of. This is the difference. If you start with ancestors who are front-loaded with massive genetic potential, you can form massive number of species like that. If you start with this point, everything else follows biologically. If instead you're an evolutionist and you say, no front-loaded, no God to hardwire into these creatures when he creates them the potential. Instead, it's all mutation, genetic mistakes, compounded over millions of years, no front-loaded diversity, you get the evolutionary model. So if you say just mutations, then it takes millions of years, long periods of time, and anything can form anything else. There's a second point here that I didn't emphasize as much in our biblical discussion. God and the text of Genesis implied that when you take two of every kind on board the ark, there's limits. Let me make the reverse scenario so you can follow this. And I'll justify it just briefly. I do it more extensively in that online article. What if any creature could form any other creature? What if a zebra could evolve into a dog or a bacteria? There would be absolutely no need for an ark. That whole story is pointless. if there are no limits to biological change. So simply the fact that God commands Noah to bring 2 of every kind of creature implies that there's limits of change. There's a big difference between creation and evolution. And this idea of front-loaded genetic diversity naturally explains how and why. Almost all of your potential for change is hardwired from the start. Do mutations happen? Yes. Do they contribute much? Not really. Bacteria maybe more so. But in mammals, reptiles, amphibians, very little. Millions of genetic differences hardwired in from the start. In a single generation, you can get all sorts of outcomes, and in subsequent generations, even more so. That gives you a whole diversity of options, but also within limits. Because there are certain things God doesn't hardwire into you a kind from the start. Evolution says it's mutations plus selection. So in theory, it should be long periods of time that is what you need, and it can form anything else. There's a whole other reason why it doesn't actually work. I discussed it in the, I think it was in the March webinar we did on evolution, replacing Darwin. And you can see more there if you want the details of why the evolutionary part doesn't work. I'm trying to discuss this from the perspective of Noah's Ark. If you have front-loaded genetic diversity, it explains almost everything you need to explain, just like that. So that's the answer to the attack from the other side, hyperevolution. So again, to summarize what we've discussed through the lens of the skeptic, you can't fit all the animals aboard the ark. Yes, you can if you are aware of the concept of kinds, which is what the Bible teaches and has always taught. So that eliminates this is a new idea. Well, kinds forces you towards hyperevolution. Not if you allow for God to create genetic diversity from the start. Real easy. Solves that problem. So let's now stop and reflect on the strength of the evidence. For all that I've just described, I've just laid out for you a comprehensive, scientifically testable, cohesive, workable explanation for the origin of species. And in my book, in the papers, I go through the evidence why it's superior. Now, the question, of course, is the evidence superior? How strong is it compared to evolution? And one of the main ways people ask this question is, if what I'm saying is true, why does almost everyone in the scientific community disagree with it? Here's survey results from the Pew Forum in the United States asking Ph.D. scientists, how did humans arise? Did they evolve due to processes such as natural selection? Over 90% say yes. Some say they evolved guided by God, which is a theistic evolution position. So they're now up to 98%. And 1% or less give something that sounds kind of like a creationist answer. What I'm saying is true. Why do so many scientists disagree? So I have an article on our website, same series, The Origin of Species After the Flood. Why don't more people accept this view if the evidence is so strong? Well, the answer I put in print was simple. I say in the United States, at least, the answer is ignorance. In a sense, the objection is circular. We've had decades of mandating only evolution in schools, forbidding the teaching of creation science because they say it's religion. We've put generations of students through high school, university, PhDs, forbidding them to consider the evidence for the other side. Is it any wonder? None of them hold to creation. None of them are ever exposed to the other side. And this concept, I think, works in the vast majority of cases. It explains Jerry Coyne. He's still repeating this outdated, unbiblical concept of Noah taking species on board the ark. They just aren't even aware. Of course they aren't aware because laws in the United States forbid this, and perhaps elsewhere the same is also true. One objection to this, though, is the existence of people who are aware of what creationists hold to and still reject it. This will get us closer to the critics' answer about the strength of the evidence. So I'm going to talk about a man named Joel Duff here. He's got a website called thenaturalhistorian.com. He's got a whole archive critiquing the young earth, there's the term, hyperevolution hypothesis. So he knows we believe in kinds. He knows this implies lots of new species would have formed in a few thousand years, and he says it's all wrong. Again, his website, thenaturalhistorian.com. He is a biology professor at the University of Akron here in Ohio, so just across the river from where I am here in Kentucky. And he says a longtime member of the Presbyterian Church in America, professing Christian. One of the big theistic evolutionary organizations in the United States is Biologos, founded by Francis Collins. So here's their, we present an evolutionary understanding of God's creation. Sort of the Faraday of the United States, if you're watching this from the UK. They have a forum. People can log on, add comments. Who does Biologos turn to? Well, they want to deal with young Earth creation science and young Earth creation biology. Joel Duff, that's their reference. You can see they're linking directly to his archive, Young Earth Creationist Critiques. So I'm highlighting Joel Duff, not just because we got to pick someone, because he is the authority that major organizations turn to. So he's an author of an article on the Biologos website. Did modern animals evolve from the animal inhabitants on board the ark? He and his colleagues have even published a peer-reviewed paper, Hyperrapid Speciation. This is last summer. So what do you do? What does a creationist do with someone like Joel Duff? Educated, smart, aware of what the other side says, yet adamantly rejects what creation scientists said, not persuaded of it, and he's the one everyone else looks to for the answers. Why am I bringing all this up? Well, I've showed you that evolutionists have attacked it from this side, and I've given answers to both. Why aren't they persuaded? Does it mean the evidence is weak? No, I'd say the evidence is strong. Why would I say the evidence is strong? Because what's the evolutionist going to do? If I've answered one objection, answered the other objection, what would Joel Duff do now that we've put all these answers in print? He's resorted to lying. And I've documented this. That's a strong accusation to make. It's a very strong accusation to make in public against a professing Christian. I've documented all this in print last summer. So and this goes through that peer-reviewed article in which they misquote the paper, misrepresent what we say knowingly. And again, these are long articles, because if you're going to make such a serious accusation, you have to have some serious justification for it. And you can see these. I mean, they responded. One of his co-authors responded. They've never made a correction to this paper a year later, which tells me something. It could be an honest mistake. We're just very bad at reading your literature, young Earth creationists. So sorry, we evolutionists need to do better. No. If something's identified, it's not we disagree with you. It's they lied about what we said. The professional thing to do is to correct it. This happens all the time in the peer-reviewed literature. You issue a correction or retraction. Nothing's happened. That's what you would do if your intent is to misrepresent. So this is my point. It's sort of a sobering way to end, but it's a eye-opening way to end. How strong is the evidence? Why do so many people disagree? Many are not aware. Those who are have resorted to lying. That's what you do when you've run out of other options. In the way of saying, the evidence for the creationist position is strong, because the opponents of creation science have nothing left except to lie. You can read more about this, as I mentioned, in the book Replacing Darwin. Just a little more background about this. I wrote this primarily for, let's say, college students who have no creationist background and think evolution is true. I had a pastor read through it. I wanted this to be accessible. It still gets into the weeds genetically, because that's what you have to do if you're going to make the case to a skeptic. But this is the book, in a sense, I wrote for myself. I wish I had this book when I was a student in university, so that I could take this and give it to my classmates and say, you need to read this. It ends with the gospel. It's a book designed to give away, but it'll give you thorough answers to how species form. It's replacing Darwin rather than just rebutting Darwin. It answers 40-year-old objections to creation science. What evolutionists have demanded for 40 years or longer is that creationists do more than just criticize Darwin. They have to come up with a better explanation, one that makes testable predictions, a concept we could talk about another time. This does that. It meets these standards. It's a game changer. The simpler version that I wrote explicitly for believers is this one. So the first part of this book walks through, here's how species form in an understandable way from the ark. In fact, that chapter we have online, how we get this concept of kinds from Scripture, is a chapter in this book. Part 2 of this book is, here's how you use this evidence in engaging the other side. Here's what evolutionists say, and here's how what you just read directly answers that. So it's a practical book as well. A 1-hour summary of this is the DVD Replacing Darwin, which you can purchase. I think you can also find this if you subscribe to Answers TV.